Thank you very much for having me here. I'm a futurist. What does that mean? Well, I've spent over 20 years being a technologist. I'm a certified technical architect, and I've also been a business consultant, but I've been a strategist for almost my entire career. But futurism is about strategy with a longer view into the future. And I grew up in the southwest of England, in the lowlands, where water was a pleasure to deal with the sailing we used to do and the waterways. And it was also a bane of our lives, because in the lowlands, we used to flood for 20 or 30 miles square every year or so. So when I started to look into this subject of the future of water, and I've called this water the most serious business, because as I did my research, what you do is so serious and so essential for everyone in the province that we have to give it some gravity. I do about 100 hours of research preparation for each of my keynotes, and this one I think took more of my time than any of the others that I've done this year. There's so many different avenues to look at, there's so many different ways to slice it up and to have opinions about technologies and how the world's changing, that there's a lot to pack in there. So hopefully I'm going to cover a lot of things that sort of pique your interest or tell you things that you didn't necessarily know or reaffirm some of the thoughts that you have. I'm going to be around afterwards, so do come and talk to me. We might struggle to have time for Q&A, but we might squeeze one or two in, okay? So I'm going to start off by framing us in a global view. Then I'm going to talk about the water-energy nexus. That's super important. Smart water, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about cybersecurity, which is one of the most pressing things that we can consider in modern infrastructure and utility infrastructure. So what about the global view? Well, we know that there's risks with water around the world, and obviously this is centralized around the equator, but there's risks even in an abundant place like Canada and British Columbia with the water that we've actually got. We know that only 1% of the water in the world is accessible fresh water that we can use. So this is why this is a serious business. This is why what we do is essential, to get people the water that they need, not only for their families and their homes to drink, but for their businesses and to be able to build the economies that we need to do to make British Columbia abundant and Canada abundant as well. Then I started looking at the stresses around water. Around infrastructure and workforce, quality and flooding, and obviously we know that as spring turns up, we start to have the headaches of having to deal with flooding, and reading about what's happening out in Grand Forks is particularly worrisome, and I'm sure it's on a lot of people's minds in the room today. But really, water, it's essential for so many things: health, food, energy, manufacturing, transportation. But that stress is really putting all of us under a great amount of duress. I talk about agriculture a lot, like more than any other subject, funnily enough, across Canada, across the US, out into Europe as well. And actually, 93% of the water usage in Canada is around agriculture. So how can we look at that through a different lens? How can we optimize that? How can we make that industry still really effective without breaking the bank, as it were, in terms of water resources? And that brings me down to this global view, and we know what's going on in Cape Town, right? It's fast approaching, it's already in a critical situation, but the critical situation of today in Cape Town was predicted in 1990. So why, some 28 years later, are we in this pickle? Why wasn't there planning? Why weren't people actually considering how to deal with a problem where we're fast approaching like 0 day for water in Cape Town? And then when I started looking at this, and it's like, okay, what's the worry? And I chatted to a couple of friends out there, and the situation's pretty dire. The agricultural industry has been hugely impacted. There's huge job losses. There's increased poverty in a place where poverty was already a huge challenge. And this sort of starts to make me realize that water is so important for any city or town that we live in. But this 0 day idea and this worrisome situation with water isn't just restricted to one place in the south of Africa. All of these places here, so Sao Paulo, Bangalore, Beijing, London, Tokyo, Mexico, these large cities, mega cities, they've all got water problems. They've all got the potential for hitting a 0 day in the future. I was chatting to someone in Sao Paulo, and their water often goes off, and their water's often brown, and there's real supply issues there, wastewater issues there. You think I grew up in and around London as well for part of my life, and I just look at that, and you've got the Thames running through it, and you think, why is there this critical issue? There's also a critical issue in London that an Australian bank owns the entire infrastructure, but that's a Margaret Thatcher thing. Okay. I wish I could laugh about that. But that brought me back, and I was like, okay, what about Canada? About 3 months ago, I managed to get to a talk by a professor from SFU that worked with the United Nations around water strategy. And he was talking about the situation in the world, and he was talking about Canada. And we've got an abundance of water in Canada, but there's still challenges. 2016, Saskatchewan, Ontario, Nova Scotia, everything from flooding to water rationing and drought. Last year, we knew about the huge water restrictions in Alberta, the forest fires in BC that caused a bunch of troubles, the record drought in the prairies, and the flooding out in the Great Lakes Basin. So across Canada, it's really interesting, this professor told me that there's no Canada-wide water strategy, which sort of made me stop and wonder why. Is it not that important? I know at a province level and a municipal level, we take it very seriously. There are strategies, we do talk to each other, but why don't we have an overarching strategy for the whole of the country? And I've been reading a lot of reports by this guy, John Pomeroy, from the University of Saskatchewan. He actually thinks that the current situation in Canada is in sort of the middle stages of being eerily similar to what's happening in Cape Town. A situation where we could approach a 0 day where whether there might be lots of water available, the water might not be available for us to use or drink or have showers. And I started going deeper into this whole around research, and it's a very critical situation. What's happening in 2018? Well, we've already talked about what's happening out in Grand Forks a little bit this morning. I was going to put a quote in from someone in the local press, and it was a quote from a politician that was unnamed. And it was like, the problems in the Okanagan in 2018 are going to be of biblical proportions. I don't know. I don't really take these things to heart when it's got that much hyperbole. I think it's a little bit too much. But definitely there's serious considerations. The bus driver this morning, as he was driving me over here, was saying, oh yeah, the lake, that's already up. What's going to happen? There's all the damage from last year. I had a friend that owns, he inherited a house in a Soyuz. No, actually, sorry, in Kelowna. And he spent about 5 or 6 weeks last year being awake a lot and with sandbags and trying to save his home. And he's just one story out of tens of thousands of people's stories. So yeah, we've got a situation in Canada. This presentation isn't going to necessarily have all the solutions to this. This presentation is going to talk about a whole bunch of technologies and thinking that's going to maybe pique an interest in terms of some new ways of dealing with water as a whole. So water and energy has got this binding contract together. To produce energy, you need water. In fact, by 2035, the world's energy consumption will increase by 35%, which in turn will increase the water consumption by 85%. If we continue on the track that we're on right now, where fossil fuels are still part of the energy situation and the such like, we're going to be in a bad situation with water. Even trying to fix some of the climate change uses tons of water as well. There'll be a 40% shortfall of available water across the globe by 2030, with effect of 98% of global electric power generation. So the 0 day for places like British Columbia may not necessarily come through the lack of water. We may have challenges with power generation. We're really lucky to have hydro here in provinces like Alberta and Manitoba and beyond. There's going to be a lot more challenges ahead for them. But what's going to happen over the next few years is $48 to $53 trillion in cumulative global infrastructure investment in energy infrastructure. But what does energy look like in 2018? And I'm a big proponent of sustainable energy supply. And I talk about it in pretty much every presentation that I talk about. We know that the tar sands isn't a good idea. I don't think the pipeline's a good idea. That may not make me popular with everyone here. It definitely didn't make me popular with certain people in Ontario 4 weeks ago, and it definitely didn't make me popular with anyone in Alberta 2 weeks ago. But the amount of water they use for what you get out of that is terrible. It's the same with coal-fired energy plants as well. 1,100 gallons of water for each megawatt hour of power produced. Is there a new way? Well, some analysts are actually looking at bigger solutions. And some analysts came together and said, down at Stanford, and they were like, okay, what if the majority of countries in the world that have got a vast amount of energy need came together and went down a route of having renewable energy? And it worked out that 139 countries could actually change their entire landscape of energy production by 2030 and 2040 to be completely non-reliant on fossil fuels, and to go down the route of solar and hydro and wind and the such like. And I think this is our future. And I say that very seriously. I do not think that fossil fuels is going to play a huge role going ahead. Interestingly enough, with solar, 0 gallons of water for each megawatt hour of power produced. Solar makes sense to me. The cost of solar has gone down. The amount of installations has gone up exponentially. Huge amount of growth. Especially every single day, I read newspaper reports of the changes across the world in places like Germany and Denmark, Norway, even down in the States, places like California. Okay, maybe a couple of gallons will be used in cleaning the solar panels, right? But that's about it. Keeping them maintained. This is fascinating to me. The World Economic Forum released an article, and solar in the world, especially in China, is being installed at 70,000 solar panels an hour, right now, per hour. This means that we're starting to career towards a world where we can harness the energy of the sun, which never runs out, and we can use that to power the world. In fact, in China, they're doing amazing things. This is a company called Green Panda. So as you fly over it, you actually see, this is a 248-acre solar farm. We see amazing things happening in places like Brooks, Alberta, a 78-acre solar farm out there, and also out in Merritt with the Nikolas Band, which is awesome. And then we've got these amazing floating wind farms that are happening out in the North Sea. And one of the most ingenious energy solutions that I've seen recently is happening out in Toronto, where you actually put pressurized airbags underneath the lake, and when energy's cheap, you fill the airbags and they're pressurized, and when energy is expensive, they push the air out of those bags back through turbines that produce energy at the same price as it was when it was cheap. Ingenious, innovative. This is kind of future thinking that I love. But the future that we're aiming towards with energy, and this will alleviate some of the demands on the water infrastructure that we're managing and maintaining, is this idea of having a globally connected electricity power grid with renewable energy farms around the world sharing what they produce. Right now in Germany, at certain parts of the week, they produce so much energy they've had to ask consumers to turn on appliances and lights in their homes to burn some electricity because it's going to overpower the grid. Imagine if we've got smart grids that can cross borders and share that energy. This is starting in China, Russia, Japan, South Korea, with something called the Asian supergrid, but this is the global grid. And I actually think that this is a future that we're aiming towards for like 2030, 2040. You're going to see a huge amount of work being done for this. Imagine if we can share energy. Imagine if Alberta can be the new North American powerhouse, and that power was solar. They get 320 days of sunshine a year. Incredibly powerful, excuse the pun. But that brings me into the idea of thinking about smart water, intelligent ways of approaching it, intelligent uses of technology. Has anyone been to Tokyo in the room? Yeah? If you stand at the top of 55 Roppongi Hills and you look at this view, you literally cannot see anything but city. 35 million people live in Tokyo and they make it work. They have their challenges, but it's fascinating. Global cities that are mega cities. 1950, it was just Tokyo and New York City. These are cities over 10 million people. 1980, Mexico City, Sao Paulo, Osaka. 2010, 20 megacities in total. 2017, 32 megacities. People are moving into cities. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And the urban growth per hour is incredible right now. Because people know that if you go to the city, there's more jobs, there's better quality of education in certain aspects, there's more people to connect with, and there's more opportunity. It's very difficult when you're living in more rural areas to make that happen. I know, I grew up in a rural area and I moved to London as soon as I could. But what's really interesting, by 2030, nearly 9% of the world will live in 41 cities. About 85% of the people in the world will live in will live in cities full stop by 2030. That's a stat from the United Nations. And that brings me on to the idea of smart cities. We've seen a lot of this in the press. We've seen a lot of people talking about putting technology in to change how a city works, doing planning differently, thinking about water in a different way within the city context. Well, smart cities have got so many different elements to it. You've got data pipes that you can connect all the essential services to, libraries, colleges, emergency services. You've got renewable energy, you've got homes with solar on the roof. You've got battery stations where you can store that energy from the sun. But right now, and this is fascinating to me, and I was speaking to a delegation from China last week, there's over 1,000 smart city projects in progress right now, pilot projects. And people are starting to realize that if we can manage the city better using technology, we can ultimately create something that's programmable. And if you can have a programmable city, it means that we can adjust and we can monitor and we can use various kinds of predictive analytics and AI, and I'll talk about that later, to help us manage that infrastructure. But what's fascinating is China is growing so rapidly at the moment that 500 of those 1,000 smart city pilot projects are actually happening out there. And what's interesting is they literally build a city from scratch. So we can look to China for some really good practices around building cities and city planning. Back in 2008, when the crash happened, Barcelona knew it had to do something about how it managed its city. And, you know, Spain isn't a wealthy country. It's tough. It's a tough economy. But Barcelona is a city that stepped forward. They formed 12 teams to look at different areas across the city, everything from water and wastewater through to lighting, to parking, to whatever, and to try and work out how they can deploy a bunch of technologies to make their city more connected, save money, and create a burgeoning economy. Well, they implemented a plan with sensors and technologies. They saved $95 million annually through smart lighting and water management, which is amazing. Increased parking revenues by $50 million per year. I don't know what they were doing with parking before. I'm just going to assume that they didn't charge for parking. But what's really interesting, when they started to implement all of these technologies, and you can, if you go online, you can search for them and see a lot of what they implemented. They created 47,000 new jobs. So a lot of people think that new technology is going to come in and destroy economies and destroy jobs. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think the new technologies give you the ability to do different things with your time that are more useful and strategic. Thinking about city design, There's these amazing infrastructures around sponge cities. That is using the wastewater that falls on a city. In fact, if we go to China, they're actually saying that they want 80% of urban areas to absorb and reuse at least 70% of rainwater by 2020. They know that there's going to be a water situation, so why not design these new cities to actually absorb the water, push that back into the system and reuse that? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. And the context I'm going to talk about that in is around smart buildings. This is out in Amsterdam. This is Deloitte's HQ. It's called The Edge. When they went down to actually do the naming of this building, I just wonder what else they had. The Edge, oh yeah, edgy, interesting, future, modern, wow. Well, The Edge is really interesting. They can actually manage and monitor occupancy, movement, lighting levels, humidity, and temperature. But they also do good water management. They collect rainwater, and they use that to flush the toilets and irrigate the green terrace and the garden areas. It's a step in the right direction. And they've got wells that go all the way down to the aquifer. It's a new way of thinking about building buildings, right? Does anyone know what this is? Apple's HQ, new HQ down in California. This is what a company that's worth nearly $900 billion looks like. Very much like the future. This one building can have over 12,000 employees. It's got a 1,000-person auditorium, 80% green space, which is fascinating to me, 100% renewable energy to power it, and it's got a natural ventilation system that works for 75% of the year. California's pretty hot in the summer, so it's not 100% of the year. But the way that Apple approached this was collaboratively. They knew that they couldn't just build a new building and suddenly that's good. They couldn't just tap into the water resources that were down in that part of California, down in Santa Clara. So what they did was they did something called the Recycled Water Project, and they did a partnership with the California Water Service Company, the city of Sunnyvale, I was there a couple of weeks ago, Santa Clara Valley Water District, and Apple put millions of dollars into the plan because they were going to be a responsible member of that community, and they were going to build their technology so they didn't draw on all of the water that was needed. So really, the infrastructure investment that they made was for the greater good of the area. And I think that as large companies come into our areas, this is sort of an approach that we need to start talking to them about, that they have a responsibility to feed back into the community, and the community needs water. And then if you go to San Francisco, and I was there 2 weeks ago, there's this massive building in the middle of San Francisco, and it's the Salesforce Com Building. Again, this is a building from a company that's worth hundreds of billions of dollars. But again, they've been super responsible about building a building that's more self-sustaining. When I was looking at what they were doing with water, it was fascinating to me. They were using some technology, I think it's from Australia, and it's black water technology. So they're reducing the local drain on local resources, and in California, water resources are sparse, by 7.8 million gallons a year, or 30,000 gallons daily. The system will result in a 76% reduction in the building's water footprint. So as we've got these new capabilities and these new companies coming into cities building new infrastructure, I think it's their absolute responsibility to not draw on what we're doing. We don't need them to make our lives difficult. The story about them bringing a burgeoning economy isn't good enough. That doesn't fix or help us manage water more effectively. They've got to put their money where their mouth is. And I like to think about really smart buildings. When you've got millions more people moving to these cities, and cities are growing larger and larger, and they become these mega cities, we have to get really smart about thinking about provision of food. As people do move to cities, and we do career towards a world where by 2050 we could have 9 billion people, so 1.5 billion people more than we have today, food production has to raise by 60%. And that's not necessarily going to come from the fields. And there's fewer farmers, and there's larger acreages to manage, and there's a whole bunch of technology that can help with that, and I talk about that. But I like to think about vertical farming. It's really difficult to do, but there's some people that are doing it really effectively, and I think that it's going to become more of a standard as we look forward into places like Penticton, Kelowna, Vancouver, Langley, Abbotsford, wherever. I think that these operations are going to be standard. And what's really interesting is, if you grow in hydroponics, you use around 95% less water, and you don't need to use fertilizers, pesticides, or herbicides or fungicides. So the food's better, it's greens, you can grow them more quickly, and they're cleaner. And potentially in abandoned factories or on the top of buildings. You actually find it in places like Hong Kong, they actually build them on the top of the skyscrapers there. Elon Musk's brother, Kimball, has actually started a company called Square Roots. And out in Brooklyn, they've got a huge lot, and they actually use shipping containers. And they've got people that are entrepreneurs building vertical farming businesses there as incubators and going out into the world. I think that these are initiatives that we'll see more and more in other cities around Western Canada and beyond. Then we've got aquaponics. So being able to grow fish and use the waste from the fish that goes into the plants. And you can even do this in smaller units at home or in larger scale. I think it's really interesting. It's a closed water system. Doesn't necessarily draw on a lot of supply. Then I like to start thinking about innovations, the new thinking that's changing how we look at water, use water, consume water. And really, this is about devices and sensors. It's about the data that gets produced and how users use both of those as well. Careering towards a world of big data and using that as insight to change how we manage, optimize, innovate, plan. There's some really interesting ideas, and these are some small ideas just to start this part of the presentation. So Fontus, this was a company that thought, oh, why don't we just pull water out of the air and have self-filling bottles? In fact, it uses solar energy and cooling condensation to fill your own water bottle. So you remove the reliance of even needing a tap to fill your water bottle, right? It's interesting. And why I find this really interesting is this is tiny, tiny scale. But what if we could start thinking about this in a larger scale as well? This is how technology scales up and can make some differences in the world. And then you've got life straw. So you can literally take this straw, go to any water source and drink from it. It's a game changer globally, especially where there's lots of contaminated water. And they've got community solutions, they've got personal solutions, filtration technology. And then I started to think about, what about rainwater? What about the rain that falls on our buildings? I live in Vancouver, so that's about 8 months out of the year. So studies show that a typical house with a 1,500 square foot roof in an area that receives 12 inches of rain a year can collect over 10,000 gallons of water a year. So it's not necessarily easy to reuse that and put that back into the system in a way that's easy for us to manage, but maybe we can step forward and let people use it themselves. In California, I think it's June the 2nd, they've actually got a Proposition 72, which will actually incentivize people, if it gets passed, to actually capture rainwater and use it on their properties. So they get tax breaks for doing that as a way to alleviate the water situation in California. There are places around the world that don't let you do this kind of thing, and it sort of seems backward to me. There's companies out of like Toronto, like RainGrid, that uses at-home solutions for capturing rainwater and pushing it back into the system, thus reducing the need to pull off of the public utility. And then you've got technologies like this, where you could put on a pair of glasses, and when you're doing works and you're looking for pipes that are broken or trying to work out how infrastructure is working, you can actually have augmented reality and looking around to see through the pavement and through the streets to the pipes that are happening underneath. And if you've got enough sensors there, you can see the water flow before you start digging, before you start doing your analysis, before making all the phone calls and having to go back to the drawing board in certain roadworks. In situ analysis. I love that. I also love really smart ways of making it fun to be part of the solution. This is a company that started another successful Kickstarter. And what they had was a little robot that people could game. So you could go online and you could control a robot to capture trash that's floating in waterways. Again, it's small scale, but it's interesting. If we can get the public to be part of the solution and to care more about things, that makes our lives a lot easier, right? And that brings me down to what people are calling the Internet of Things. So in the world today, there's about 20 billion devices connected with sensors, cameras, whatever, collecting data. We're generating data at 4.4 zettabytes of data per year right now. By 2025, that'll be 163 zettabytes of data per year. That's the equivalent of a billion high-definition movies. We can only really use 1% of that. But that insight, the sensors are going to help us optimize how we use things, help us with planning, turn things off when they're no longer needed, rather than just having everything on and running. And that brings me back to thinking about the Internet of Things in agriculture. So irrigation in the world accounts for 2.6 quintillion gallons of water per year. So if we can work out a situation where we can stop irrigation when it's no longer needed and turn it on when it's needed the most, we're going to actually reduce that down, and that will take the pressure off of us that are managing water resources. A company called Waterbit, put this sensor in the ground. They save hundreds of labor hours, improve crop quality, and increase yield, in addition to running irrigation in a better way. So this, to me, makes me realize that water and good management of water has got so many side benefits that people don't necessarily realize. Economic benefits. And then we know that we've got satellites up in the air, and the satellite we can use the scanning and the pictures that come from them, the infrared imagery, and it can go down to help us work out what's happening with transpiration, evaporation. And if we've got that real view on the world on a daily basis, we can make some smart decisions locally. And some of these stations that are placed in fields across Canada help with that study. Information is power. Data is the new oil. Data is the thing that's going to be running your businesses. You already know that. Hands up who loves doing reports. No one. I don't mind reports. I'm a data nerd. When I wrote a report earlier this year, I wrote a report called 2018, the Year of Radical Creativity. I looked at the people that were thinking completely differently about solutions for energy and management of cities and whatever in the world. And I found it really interesting. 71% of the world is water, we know, and it's always evaporating, always evaporating. What if we could move to a world where we could have this kind of technology? This is very small. It's about yay big. This is an evaporation engine that's been developed out of Columbia University in their R&D labs. And this is made out of sticky tape and plastic. It's made out of spores that soak up water in the air and drive this wheel to power a light bulb. If you think about this, say we go to Lake Okanagan and maybe we cover 100 meters square of it in evaporation engine technology. Maybe we could power a number of homes and we could take some of that evaporation out of the atmosphere. We know that the world is evaporating more and more, and that's causing some of the problems. So maybe there's a dual benefit to this. I love technology like this. Really edgy, different, radically creative. And during the talks with the team that were producing the event, it's like, oh, what about predictive analytics, artificial intelligence? Are there solutions out there that this new world is going to help us with? So artificial intelligence is something that people are starting to get scared of because the media has made it out like we're going to end up in a Terminator-like situation and Skynet's going to come online and suddenly, water treatment plants are going to turn on us. Don't quite think that's going to happen. But artificial intelligence has gotten more powerful over the years. So what does AI promise? AI promises to process data more quickly, but look at it in a different way and to process it like humans process it, but then go beyond our capability of analysis and act on that. So in 1997, Garry Kasparov got beaten by IBM's chess computer, Big Blue. Beaten. 2011, IBM's Watson won Jeopardy and won $1 million, beaten the humans. In 2017, ninth Dan Lee Sedol, world grandmaster of the Chinese game of Go, was beaten 4 games to 1. That game is so complicated. It's thousands of times more complicated than something like chess. And he learned more beautiful, more empathetic, human and creative moves from the machine than he imagined he could learn from any human. So that makes me wonder about that relationship between us and the machines. And then, the people from Google that built that technology, they built something called AlphaZero that learned chess in 4 hours and became completely unbeatable. It learned the game of Go instead of learning all of the games of Go that went before it and playing the grand champion, and it won 100 games to 1. No one can beat it now. No, actually, incidentally enough, no one can beat Lee Sedol now either, because he learned from the computer. Lots of new ways of playing. So AI has become this fast technology that's changing the world. The momentum behind it, the investment in it, is going to have a huge impact to the economy. And there's technology that helps in water management. I found 3 kinds of technologies that I just want to highlight. The first one's Fracta, and it looks at analysis of data in the soil, which pipes rest, the topography, the weather records, and then applies machine learning, so the ability to process trillions of lines of data in real time. And then look at that across an entire region. And then it can work out which pipes have got the greatest risk of failure. That, to me, seems like something that's a simple solution that can save millions of dollars every single year for most utility companies, right? A company called Pluto is actually used in wastewater plants, and it can actually predict 50 to 70% of plant failures because it's been optimized for water data. I think this technology actually started it in oil rigs, but they found it was a little bit better for water, philosophically as well as ethically. It determines the best operating parameters to spend the lowest amount of energy per gallon of water produced. And that's what we're all about, reducing costs, right? Then Valor Water Analytics, I think they were actually purchased by Xylem. Oh, I've seen Xylem here. And they use machine learning algorithms to detect inaccuracies, anomalies in metadata. Back in the day, I used to build telecommunications billing systems, and I worked with Wessex Water in Somerset, up in Bristol, on metering and rate plans and a whole bunch of things. And yeah, nothing's perfect when something's mechanical. But if you can use artificial intelligence to actually work out those inaccuracies, you're going to claw back lots of money, especially from industrial usage. And someone was saying to me, but what about the future of work? AI and automation, robotics, all of these things are coming in. Is half of us going to be out of work? Well, there's this really smart researchers at the Brookfield Institute, part of Ryerson in Toronto. I know the team over there. They produced this report last year called The Talented Mr. Robot, and go and download it. It's fascinating. That report says that 42% of Canadian jobs are at risk of being affected by automation. The ones that are at high risk of automation are like truck drivers, people that work in banks as tellers, people that work in retail, in food service. If something's algorithmic and you can do it step by step, then you can replicate that in software, then that job's going to disappear. A lot of us are very hands-off. We have to drive places. We have to talk to teams. They're very difficult to automate. But parts of our lives will be automated. But does that mean that suddenly we're going to lose tons of employees? I don't think that that's the future. And the mainstream media literally says that this is going to destroy economies, and I think that they're wrong. Because at no point in history did we ever have a technology come in and destroy economies. It changed the landscape. Industrial Revolution, the spinning jenny. You no longer needed people to weave cloth. What do those people do? Well, they went off and they became designers and they did other jobs. And they built the economy in other areas. When electricity came and trams were replacing horses, you know what? The people that looked after the horses just went and did something else. When computers turned up and there was the promise of the paperless office, it never quite delivered on that promise, right? But computers made us more productive, and that's what's going to happen with automation. With artificial intelligence and the new world of work, whether it's in water plants or in the head offices of water utilities, it's going to be about human and the machine. It's going to make us better at our jobs, and it's going to remove the things that we don't like doing from our plates. And this is the traditional model of information. So we collect data, we process that into information, and then that becomes knowledge. Now, artificial intelligence will take care of pulling data and throwing it into spreadsheets. Hands up who loves building spreadsheets. Oh, no. There's always some. I used to love doing it. No, I don't do it at all. But when it becomes to actually taking what's been put into spreadsheets and graphs and whatever, we then have to work with that technology to refine that. It starts to become knowledge. But what is really interesting is that we're heading towards a wisdom economy. Our experience will be used to overlay a narrative and strategic thought over the top of the information and knowledge that we're provided. Instead of spending 40 hours a week trying to wrestle data into a certain format, that literally you're people building graphs and you're not people building wisdom. I think that we're going to be liberated. I'm an optimist, but I do think that this is the future. Okay, we've talked about AI, we've talked about the Internet of Things, we've talked about smart buildings, the infrastructure, this is the internet and the cloud, dashboards, optimization, throttle this, change that, adjust, plan better. But when we connect these systems to the internet, we're going to have issues. And cybersecurity has become something that gets spoken about more often than not. The market alone in cybersecurity by 2023 is going to be a $165.2 billion market. Every 4 seconds, a company is hacked. Someone hacked my website like 3 weeks ago, like 11,000 penetration attempts through a booking form, and I didn't get one single booking. I can kind of guess what part of the world that these attacks came from, judging by some of the traffic problems I was having from the month before. I had it locked down, but just for me individually, that cost me $2,000 to fix. Can you imagine what that's like for large businesses? If you remember the Sony hack, it cost them hundreds of millions of dollars. If you look at waterworks and treatment plants, you're probably familiar with programmable logic controllers, PLCs. They're probably everywhere. Now, PLCs aren't particularly secure, but they can be if we take the right actions. A few years ago, about 2012, you would have remembered maybe a story about Natanz in Iran and the uranium enrichment facility that kept failing and breaking. Well, the Americans and the Israelis conspired to put together a virus called Olympic Games, more popularly because it was under confidential, it was secret, top secret. It was known as Stuxnet because Kaspersky actually decoded that and worked out what it was. Someone could go in via a USB key that was dropped in a car park in one of the partners of the Natanz facility, put it into their computer. They walked it into the facility, unbeknownst to themselves, and just used that key. It didn't look like it was anything but an empty key. And it spread the virus inside that facility. And it basically caused these centrifuges to blow up. This has got a side effect. Now Iran's got one of the largest cybersecurity and cyber terrorist workforces in the world. And Iran's in the news a lot right now. But what about water treatment plants, PLCs, and other parts of the technology there? Well, when I was looking through this, it's like, there must be a story here. And there's a couple of interesting parts about this story I'm going to tell you. There was a Verizon report that was highlighting a problem. Now, it's a story about the Chimera Water Company. The Chimera Water Company doesn't exist. It's a made-up name. This is a water company in North America that does not want to be named for a very good reason. Someone was going in and changing duct movements that controlled chemical changes within the water supply, for cleaning, whatever, using PLCs, and it was messing with the water flow rate and causing disruption with water distribution and caused millions of dollars of damage because people didn't look after their technical infrastructure. It had these three problems. And I want you to, the people that work in wastewater and water treatment plants, I want you to look at these and reflect. Number one, internet-facing servers, especially those directly connected to SCADA management, were not that secure. The passwords weren't strong. It's probably the one thing that we can be good at, is to create very, very strong passwords. Outdated systems were missing software patches. When the WannaCry virus went around the world, hijacking like schools and hospitals for ransom for Bitcoin, just last year, it was because people just didn't put in a patch that was 6 months old. And it cost people like millions of dollars because of tardiness in terms of cybersecurity. And then, number three, lack of isolation of critical assets, weak authentication mechanisms, and the unsafe practices of protecting passwords. There's one image that I actually show, and it's someone in a government facility in the US. And it's a picture of this guy, and he's in the paper, and they're like, look at our new facility around security of our utility. And there's a little sticky note on the computer just by him. In the press, it's just got the word password at the top. And it lists a password underneath. I'm not going to ask anyone to put their hands up if they've ever written a password down, but you shouldn't. And your password shouldn't be the name of your kids or your surname or your favorite band. It should be something that makes no sense at all. And very, very long. Numbers, alphanumeric characters, special characters. And maybe you thought, security, let's put tons of internet-connected cameras into our facilities as well. Because people can still break in and cause damage. Well, you've got to be really careful with that. Because 2 years ago, there was a piece of software called a botnet, and it's called Mirai, which is Japanese for freedom. Hackers love giving their programs really weird names. Well, that freedom resulted in 2 days of mayhem across the world. And that mayhem actually closed down CNN and Reddit, Spotify, Pinterest, The Guardian, Wall Street Journal, Fox News, PayPal. PayPal. That's basically banking infrastructure. Because people didn't password protect their internet-connected devices. A guy in Russia actually put 45,000 unprotected devices, including like baby monitors and cameras in kids' rooms and schools, online just to show people that they were just not protecting their own world. So if you're thinking about cybersecurity, if you're thinking about being serious about protecting yourselves, you're going to double down on having penetration testing on your sites, and you're going to be very careful when you introduce new technology. That's fun. Cybersecurity is one thing that I talk about in every single presentation, because there's still problems in the world. And we're just really lucky that we've gotten away with it for a long time. We don't want to be the next Chimera Water Company, right? So there's some final thoughts I have. When we start thinking about water and we start thinking about this infrastructure, what does that mean to us? What does that mean to us humans? Are we treating it in the way that it needs to be treated? Is it an asset? Is it an essential commodity? Or is it something a little bit more important than that? You may have seen a film called The Big Short that came out in 2015. It was about a guy called Michael Burry and a bunch of other people that chose to short the housing market in America around about 2005, 2006. And no one believed it was coming. This guy knew it was coming. They made a lot of money. In the years that his hedge fund ran, I think they made something like 486% for its shareholders and the people that invested with it. Incredible. He shorted the housing market. He's also someone that's incredibly smart and looking at the world, and he believes that fresh, clean water cannot be taken for granted. And he's investing in companies that have a reliance on fresh, clean water for what they produce, and they sell it to places that do not have those products. So is water a commodity that can be traded? We know that China's into places like DR Congo, and they're owning up huge parts of Africa. Land-wise, they own the aquifer underneath, right? Or certainly access to it. So is it that commodity? Should it be treated that way? Or should it be treated in a slightly different way? I'm going to play a short video with a young First Nations girl, 13 years old, a water guardian from Canada, went to the UN General Council. And when I watched this, and I watched this at the early part of me putting together this presentation, it really hit home with me.
Many people don't think water is alive or has a spirit. My people believe this to be true. There are studies now that prove this. We believe our water is sacred because we are born of water and live in water for 9 months. When the water breaks, new life comes. But even deeper than that, we come from our mother's water and her mother's water, and so on. All the original water flows through us from the beginning and all around us.
And it goes on for about 15 minutes, this talk. It's very deep, it's very poignant. It makes me think philosophically about what water is. Water is essential. The reason I called this presentation Water the Most Serious Business is because what you're all doing is you're fulfilling the role of being water guardians. And I don't think that you think about this as a commodity that can be traded away. You think about it as something essential, that our children we can drink the water, the industries can build our economies, and we can do something useful with that. This idea of being water guardians is something I want to leave you with. When I think about water, I think about the technologies, I think about how the world is changing. It's an incredibly complex ecosystem. I've had a huge amount of fun researching this. It's been very thought-provoking. I'd like to thank the organizers for having me here, and welcome to the future. Thank you.